with the theme of mind training that we started at the beginning of this year. So we've already had a number of talks that have introduced the mind training tradition to you, and we've already looked at what the text offers us as advice and how to face adversity in our lives. So the mind training, it's from the Mahayana school of Buddhism, and the Mahayana tradition, it takes for granted the vow that as Buddhists we want to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. So Mahayana teachings act from the basis that we're all practicing not only for our own liberation, but for the liberation of all sentient beings. And that in fact there's no distinction between these two things. It would be at most impossible and at least quite counterproductive if we were only concerned with our own awakening and not for the awakening of others. So that's the context for the mind training texts. And yeah, we're looking at how we can transform any adversity in our lives into the path to this enlightenment for ourselves and others. And the mind training texts, they give us the means and some quite pithy slogans, kind of pithy instructions that we can call to mind and reflect on at any point. We can try and put these slogans into action in our body, in our speech and our mind, in the midst of whatever life we're leading, whatever engaged or complex life we might have. These slogans help us to put Buddhist ideas into practice in that everyday situation, no matter how difficult or complex it might be. So yeah, whatever we come across in our lives, the mind training slogans, they help us to face the facts that it's our mind that creates our experience of our life, and that we can, if we want to, transform our responses to the world through transforming our minds. So mind training is transforming our minds to transform our responses to the world, particularly to adversity. So it's quite an exciting practice. It's a radical practice. Sometimes it's challenging. And it's calling us to go beyond our usual habitual mental responses. So the mind training is saying you can go beyond those. You can go beyond your habitual responses, your habitual ways of behaving. You can go beyond your conditioned views about how best to get by in life, which actually often trip us up. So tonight we're going to look at the next slogan, which is going beyond blame. Well, the title is going beyond blame. I'm going to save the slogan until a little bit later because I want to give you some context. But the area that we're looking at tonight is going beyond blame. Okay, so what is blame? I looked it up, like I do like a definition. So the verb to blame is to feel or declare that someone or something is responsible for a fault or wrong. So feeling or declaring that someone or something is responsible for a fault or wrong. And the noun, blame in itself as a noun, is the responsibility for a fault or wrong. Okay? We're probably fairly familiar with it. I've got another little quote here. Blame is the act of censuring, holding responsible, making negative statements about an individual or group that their action or actions are socially or morally irresponsible, and it's the opposite of praise. So it's not been a particularly easy mental state or function to dwell on as I've been writing this talk. You know, it's not been like the most pleasant thing to do, just, you know, dwell upon blame, become more and more and more aware of all the times I blame others. And yeah, it's not easy to admit to blame either. And quite a lot of us, we probably like to think of ourselves as quite easygoing people. You know, people can do what they like. Other talks that I've given about gratitude or about faith, they've left me feeling a little bit brighter, a little bit lighter. We're in a kind of shadowy aspect of ourselves here by looking at blame. And I can feel it in myself, this shadow of dwelling on this negative, reactive mental state. Okay, it's not pleasant, but we're here, we're together, we can do this. Okay, so yeah, it can be humbling, it can be unpleasant. We're in the shady, murky depths of our own aversion and of our own ill will. So why do we blame? Why is that something that does happen most days, probably to most of us? So we all know well enough that through expecting happiness to come from outside of ourselves, we are often frustrated. Okay, we don't get what we want, and we get what we don't want. And we expect our happiness to come from outside of ourselves, and that's always frustrating. But we all have this wrong view on some level. So this view that happiness will come from outside of ourselves is usually at play on some level in our daily lives. That can lead to comfort eating, it can lead to neurotic Netflix watching, it can lead to obsessive email checking. You know, we're always looking outside of ourselves for something. And it would follow this logic, if we have this logic or this wrong view of the world. Just let this person in. You might have to go to the back and there should be some more chairs, yeah. So yeah, if we have this wrong view that happiness can come from outside of ourselves, which, let's face it, probably most of us do have this view on some level, that it follows that if we are unhappy, then we'll look for some external reason for this. We'll be like, well, this isn't what I wanted, and happiness is supposed to come from out there, so who's to blame? How can I explain this situation of suffering or dissatisfaction by blaming something outside of myself? So we look to blame some external other if we're suffering. That's often the case. But yeah, if we expect to be able to cultivate a life that is always pleasant, if we expect that we could always be happy, if we expect to be able to control our experiences in a particular way to always avoid pain and adversity, then we will always be disappointed. So we've heard about this already in the talks within this series. Dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, it is a fact of human existence. And if we look to blame others for this, then there's no way that this is going to help us to avoid unsatisfactoriness. If we get into this game of blaming everybody else or other instances for our own unhappiness, we're only going to hurt ourselves further, drive that pain deeper. And yet we do it all the time, in little ways, most of the time. Whenever something doesn't go our way, we're like, oh, you know, the bus is late, who's made this bus late? Maybe it's the driver, maybe it's the company. Our Virgin broadband bill's gone up. Who didn't check what amount was going out of the Virgin broadband bill? Whose fault is this that we've paid? You know, it's just like little things like that can always be happening every day. And we've already seen earlier in this theme that blame is something that we can renounce and go beyond and transcend. And during Pradaya's talk, he introduced the worldly winds to us. And if you remember during that praise and blame are two poles within the worldly wind. So we all want praise. Praise is lovely. We don't want blame. So we've all seen already that we can try to allow these winds to blow. They will happen. We will experience blame, we will experience praise, but if we just always try to get the praise and never the blame, then we're going to kind of get blown around. We're not going to have any equanimity in our lives. So we need to look for a sense of equanimity within this, rather than trying to base our lives on only just getting the good stuff and avoiding the bad. But often our views on what is good and what is bad for us in life, what will bring us happiness and what won't, are limited and limiting, and this also came out in Pradaya's talk. So often our very views on what we want to have in our lives to bring us happiness and fulfillment is limiting, and we will face adversity in our lives. That is a given. So just a little caveat here. The ideal to transcend blame that we're looking at tonight, it's not suggesting that those who break the law or those people who may act in ways that harm other people or put others at risk should not be held accountable for their actions. So I'm not saying that people who break the law or act in ways that harm other people shouldn't be held in some way accountable for their actions, either by law or by society. But blame and resentment, continuing to allow blame and resentment to kind of to play out without any check or without any reflection, itself won't help those situations. It won't help us in those situations, and it won't help others. So blame and resentment itself, it does not promote our own happiness. It only drives our pain deeper. And blame and resentment, it doesn't lead to a realistic or wise perspective of complex conditions that are at play in the world. The Buddha talked about blame as being like holding on to hot coals. So we only hurt ourselves if we hold on to hot coals. And in our anger and in our ill will, it can feel that reacting with blame or with anger can help when we reach for a hot coal to throw at somebody so that they know they've hurt us. But by reaching those hot coals, holding on to them, we're only burning ourselves. So the Buddha related blame to like holding on to a hot coal. We only hurt ourselves through blame. We only bring more pain and suffering to ourselves. So a little bit more about why this might be unhelpful. Why is blame unhelpful? If we're seeing ourselves as fixed and separate over here, wanting happiness from out there and not getting it and therefore blaming the other, then we're continuing to see the world in this separate and fixed sense. And it's a very simplified way of seeing situations by looking for a single cause. Why am I unhappy? There must be a reason for this. I've got to find that reason and blame that person. So it separates us, it fixes us and other people, it simplifies situations, and it doesn't allow for the truth of conditioned co-production or mutual arising, where all things are interconnected, all things are part of a complex set of processes. And Vidanya, in his talk last week, he talked about gratitude, and in a way these talks kind of provide a little couplet, if you like, so we can feel gratitude for everybody because all things are interconnected and we benefit from all sorts of things that we're not even aware of. And similarly, when something happens that we may find difficult, there's a complex set of situations there as well. All things are interconnected. We can't just find one thing to blame and have done with it. And through blaming others, we only hurt ourselves. And if we are blaming other people, we're not taking personal responsibility for our own actions or reactions. So often blame, I think it's a function to push away any pain or aversion that we have to a situation. So something happens, we don't want that to happen, we feel pain. We don't want to feel pain, we're averse to that pain, so we push it away by blaming somebody else as some kind of method to try to avoid sitting with that pain. So this is a reaction. It's not a conscious holding of the situation. It's a reaction to our own responses. And any reaction means that we're not acting in the gap, which we look at on the introductory course. Any reaction means that we're not consciously choosing our response, and we're not able to guide our actions in line with the Dharma, in line with the ethical precepts, or just in line with our highest ideals. So for all these reasons, perhaps we can agree that blame, it is a negative and unskillful mental state. It's an unhelpful response that only brings more pain onto ourselves. And we'd all be best to go beyond it. So let's go beyond blame together tonight. But how? It's all very well just to say, just don't do it. It just doesn't work. Just stop it, guys. Tomorrow just, drift around and be happy. So this is where the mind training slogan comes in. How can we go beyond blame? So we are advised to gather all blame onto one. Gather all blame onto one. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be unpacking what does this mean and what might it look like for us in our lives. So usually, as I've said, when anything adverse happens to us in our lives, and we experience pain or dissatisfaction or any form of inconvenience, any form of dukkha, if we don't get our own way with something, we focus on whose fault that is. Okay, who did what to us? Whether it was something that they said or that they did, or something that they didn't say or didn't do, whatever it is, we usually have a sense of who should have done something different so that we're not suffering. We might think how everything could or should have played out differently. If just that little thing hadn't happened or that little thing hadn't happened, I wouldn't be suffering right now. If only so-and-so did this, if only they didn't do that, then I would have been okay. Then I'd be happier right now. And I was thinking, I even watched a clip. I don't know if you remember Little Britain. It was a sitcom series a few years ago, and there was a character called Vicky Pollard, and she was like this kind of teenager who would... She'd basically say, yeah, but no, but a lot. So she'd be in some situation that she probably had got herself into, and she'd be like, yeah, but so-and-so doesn't, yeah, but no, but yeah, but, and she just always tries to drive why she's not at fault. And that is a little bit like us, usually. In my mind, ever since I've known I'm going to be giving you this talk tonight, I've been aware of all these yeah buts, no buts. Oh yeah, but if they didn't do that, oh, she should have said that, and then I wouldn't have done this, and then, it's just going round and round and round and around. So that's our usual response. And this line, gather all blames onto one, is advising us to cut through this blaming others habit, for blaming others for our own suffering. It's asking us to just drop those narratives, drop the storyline, the detailed account that we could all give of how if all those other things, all those other people hadn't done the things that they'd done or weren't at fault. It's asking us to drop all of that and just consider instead, what have we brought to this situation? What have we brought to this situation? So gathering blame onto one, the one, it means ourselves. So we're gathering, there's all this blame kind of happening, perpetuating, and this slogan is saying just gather that, just gather it, drop the storyline and bring it to what you have brought to that situation. There's a lot of time and energy that can go into blaming others particularly, and this slogan is saying reflect on your own reactions and your own habitual responses and look to transform them in the light of the Dharma. All that time and energy that you're spending thinking who's at fault there, you could use by just gradually, gently looking at your own reactions, looking at your own responses. Try to transform them in the light of Dharmic understanding, maybe in the light of the ethical precepts, in the light of reality. So we can take responsibility for our own mental states, and this is the only way that we can work on them to become greater, wiser, kinder, and to have a more clear understanding of ourselves and other people. We can take responsibility for our own mental states, and that's what this slogan is suggesting that we do in any situation of adversity. So this is the challenge, this is the task, to go beyond blame by gathering all blames onto one. And you might feel up for this challenge. You might think, yeah, I'm ready to take this on. Perhaps you can see the damaging effects that blame is having on your daily life. Maybe it's having a damaging effect on your relationships, and you're really willing to turn this around. But to some people, this advice, it can sound maybe too challenging. It can sound quite harsh to gather blame onto oneself. Surely that can't be helpful. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be clarifying what this slogan is suggesting, and clarifying what this slogan is not saying. So you can hear it in all manner of ways, and I'm going to try and explain what it is saying, what it isn't saying. And I'll be weaving in a sort of commentary on my own reflections and my own way of responding to my own pain and adversity in my own life, and how I've worked with blame within that. So a bit of context. So the mind training slogans, they are a Mahayana Buddhist tradition, and the Mahayana was kind of mainly playing out in Tibet. And the context of these slogans presumes that most people have quite a strong basis of metta for themselves and metta for other people. Okay, it's coming from a culture that doesn't have generations of guilt or generations of original sin within its culture. It doesn't have a tradition of people tending to find themselves feeling low self-worth or feeling like their worth is that they're kind of done for if they acknowledge that they've done something kind of wrong or bad. Okay, so that's something that people can carry around in our culture, that if you acknowledge you've done something wrong or bad, then you're kind of done for. So the context of these slogans is that most people wouldn't have that kind of conditioning. They'd have quite a strong basis of metta. And we're all looking to develop metta for ourselves and others as we come here to practice. And I watched a documentary once where it was back when Love Film was a thing, and you could sign up for documentaries and they'd send to you them in the post. And there was this amazing, really quite old documentary about Tibetan teachers leaving Tibet and coming to the West. And quite a few of them were being interviewed. And there was one interview with 3 teachers, I think, And they were being asked, what do you think people in the West need to learn from Buddhism or from you? And they all said love. You just need to learn about love, 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 love. And they just kept repeating that. And I think they could see that in our culture, often we don't have much of a basis of love for ourselves or love for other people. And there is apparently no word for guilt in Tibetan. So that's a quote from the Dalai Lama, that there just isn't a word for guilt. So we have to bear in mind that that's the context that we're hearing this slogan in. We may tip into feeling like, oh, I'm to blame for everything, or oh, I'm originally sinful and therefore I'm going to go to hell. I don't know. I don't particularly myself have Christian conditioning. I know a lot of people do, but I still work with this sense of being somehow at fault sometimes. So this slogan, it's not saying that we need to take responsibility for things that are beyond our control. It's just saying that if we are experiencing blame and resentment that we are usually putting out to other people, that we can turn this into quite a healthy reflection on our own part in any situation. So the slogan isn't saying that we should look to cultivate blame or linger on feeling at fault for things that is kind of ethically neutral, that we needn't feel any healthy shame for. And it's not saying that we need to feel guilty or unduly at fault for unskillful actions that have been done to us or that are being done to us. So in Buddhism, shame is seen as a very positive mental state because you have your ideals that you're trying to live up to. And if you notice that your behaviour is not meeting your ideal, then there's a bit of a painful gap there. But it's putting you in touch with your ideals. It's putting you in touch with how you want to act more skillfully. So that's positive shame, not kind of thinking that we're kind of doomed because we've done something once that might have hurt somebody else. So, if we are experiencing blame and resentment, then we can turn this into a healthy reflection on what is our part in this situation. Some examples of the more ethically neutral situations where we may not need to gather blame onto ourselves for might be things like, when I started working in the evolution shop, I noticed I said sorry for most things that I did. I didn't really know why. Maybe I was feeling a bit nervous because I was in a new job and I was learning something new. But if I kind of walked past somebody, I'd be like, sorry. It was quite a small stock room. I'd be like, oh, sorry. And I realised, why am I saying sorry? I'm not doing anything that I can locate as being unskillful within the ethical precepts here. I can drop this kind of random kind of apparent blaming myself for something that I've not done anything wrong. And I used to experience that in customers too. They'd come up and apologise for buying something from your shop. I just think, it's great, just great, go, enjoy. But they'd be like, oh yeah, thanks, sorry. It's this very strange kind of phenomena. So in these instances, we can just use the ethical precepts to realise that maybe that we're carrying around some irrational guilt. We may be carrying around unnecessary anxiety, that we're doing something that's kind of wrong or bad, and we can just drop that, okay? So we can gather that kind of blame onto one and realise, oh, I can just let this go, actually. There's nothing unskillful here. And then there are examples where, or instances where there has been unskillful behaviour onto us, okay? And the suffering that can come about in response to those things. So these are more kind of personal, more sensitive areas. So we might be responding to harsh or unkind speech or action of other people. There may even have been gross violence in our lives. I know some people who have experienced the loved ones being murdered, for example. There you may have a pain at a great loss in your life. There may be suffering of betrayal in your lives or even sexual abuse. So these are areas where something unskillful has happened and you will feel all sorts of anger or pain at the result of those actions. And these experiences of greatly unskillful actions, they might have been quite traumatic for you. They're very sensitive, complex and confusing situations. And perhaps it's not easy to see how that gathering all blames onto one can help in these situations. But I truly believe that it does. And I know from my own experience and those of people that I know and love, people that are close to me, that this slogan really can help, even in these quite extreme situations where no matter how grave the suffering or how grave the unskillful action that has happened, this slogan can still help us to move towards a greater understanding and compassion for ourselves and other people. And I'm going to come back to this a bit later. Okay. But if we just go back to the more daily situations, where you're kind of rubbing up against your friends or your colleagues or your family, let's have a look at why, in detail, why might gathering all the blame onto ourselves in those situations be more effective than just blaming other people outright, like, oh, they've done that, why did they do that? And that's normally how we try and get on with things. So if we gather blame onto ourselves, it may be more directly painful. It might be that we acknowledge more why whatever we've experienced happen has brought us pain, why we're responding with a painful response. Because it's not our natural coping mechanism usually. Blame is like a coping mechanism, as I've said, to avoid the painful experiences that we don't want to have. And blame, it can be very perpetuating, quite self-perpetuating. It can be quite cyclical, it's a reaction. Whereas if we're gathering all blame onto ourselves and we're like, ooh, I don't want to blame myself, I find that quite uncomfortable, then we may be motivated more to do something to alleviate that pain that we're experiencing. And self-metta is really important here. It's really important to bring any well-wishing to ourselves as we look to stay with the pain that we're trying to avoid through blaming others. Because focusing on others and blaming others, it can lead to a kind of righteous indignation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. We can think we're justified in our blame when we blame other people. That we can think we've got quite a realistic handle on the situation and that there's nothing wrong with that response. They really shouldn't have done that. I'm really angry with them for doing that. And just going into that blame, you can feel like you've kind of sorted it. It can feel sometimes even quite clean. And we won't realise that our mental state is in fact negative and reactive. And I often find this, it comes out for me mostly when people are saying something that I'm finding inconvenient or saying something that I'm perceiving as not aware of something that I might be holding. So if I'm doing something, and this can happen, say, at home or in the midst of a busy situation, and somebody's talking to me about something that I don't want to attend to right now, I can go away feeling like, well, why do they talk to me about that now? Can't they see that I'm busy, or can't they see that I'm at home and I'm wanting to do the washing or whatever? So my blame can come in that form of like, oh, they should have known when was a better time to talk to me. And I can really feel quite righteous about that. I can really feel like my friends should be able to see when I'm ready to talk and when I'm not, and they haven't, and so that's their fault. So that's just a little example of how these things can feel. We can feel quite righteous in blaming others. And language can be a really good indicator of this. So if you're noticing that you're feeling like, oh, they made me angry, or they didn't pick a good time to talk to me about that, and so that's their fault, and that's made me angry, or that's made me upset or sad or whatever, that's showing that you're feeling quite justified in your anger, or you're putting that blame onto other people. But the Buddha, the ideal is that we wouldn't become angry in that situation. The Buddha wouldn't react with anger in any situation. Nobody can make us angry, or nobody can make us upset. That is our reaction. So we can look maybe to say that when that happened, or when he said that, I got angry, or I felt angry. And the same goes whether you're upset or sad or whatever. Gathering blame onto ourselves, it can act more as a warning signal that something's not helpful here. Their reaction is happening, and that our thinking maybe could be brought more in line with reality. Gathering blame onto ourselves can show us that maybe some reflection time is needed to turn from being reactive to being more creative. So just by saying, oh, I am angry, rather than he made me angry, you might realise, okay, there is anger here. That's unskillful. I could look to transform that anger in the light of the Dharma in the light of reality. What am I going to do about it now that I'm angry? Rather than just going into, he made me angry, it was all their fault. Yeah, so blame is by its nature quite painful, and we might not realise this if we're just blaming other people, and we might just feel righteous about doing so. By gathering all blame onto ourselves, we're consciously turning our attention to it, allowing it to be there in our experience, and acknowledging its pain. So by doing this, we're acknowledging the pain of blame, and then we can respond to it rather than just let it unconsciously fuel our anger or reactivity. So it's a mindfulness practice, it's gathering. There's all this blame happening. We're gathering it onto ourselves, and by doing that, we're acknowledging this is blame, this is unhelpful, this is reactive. What can I do about it? And I was thinking, why is it all blame? Why are we gathering all blame onto ourselves and not just some of it? Because maybe, couldn't we just reflect on how, that it's a network of conditions at play here, some people did this, I did that, there's no one person to blame. Maybe we could just approach it like that. But I think gathering all blame onto one is much more effective at cutting through all of those stories. It's just simple and straightforward. There's no perpetuation, there's no cyclic, endless going round. Or maybe it was my fault, or maybe no, it's their fault. Oh, because they did that, but then I did this, didn't I? No, but it's probably their fault. This is kind of how my mind works. If I don't just cut through it and just gather all blame onto one, there's a kind of stillness that can come with that. It is a mindfulness practice in a way that metta is very important there too, but just stopping the narrative, just stopping the storyline. Maybe it's in meditation, or maybe I'm using some body awareness to do that. It does bring greater clarity than trying to do that kind of figuring out, oh, maybe it was a bit of me, maybe it was a bit of them. Because the blame in itself is unhelpful. Blame in itself is not going to lead to a greater understanding of the situation. So gathering it onto ourselves allows us to recognise this is painful, this is unskillful, what am I going to do about it? So all blame onto one. So yeah, it's our own actions that we're concerned with here, and we can start to take responsibility for them, and this can lead to more creative, helpful states of mind. I think once we've stilled the reaction of blame, if we can still the reaction of blame, we can get into the gap, and we can find it easier to find an appropriate response to the pain and suffering that we are experiencing. No one's saying that that's not there, that is there, but we need to find an appropriate response to it. We need to find a wiser understanding in the face of adversity rather than just trying to move it along by blaming others. So we heard about the second arrow in Pradaya's talk as well. So we experience pain, we experience suffering, and that's like the first arrow. And then often we bring stories and complexity to that situation. That's like the second arrow, and blame is like the second arrow of like, oh, they did this to me, they shouldn't have done that to me. If we can just gather all blame onto one, we are working with that second arrow, we're kind of removing that second arrow and just staying with the original pain and suffering that we're experiencing. And I think this can lead to a greater understanding of these complex conditions that are at play in any situation. It's too black and white to think that there's a single cause for a situation. The world is much more colourful than that, much more complex. There are shades of grey, there's black, white, there's shades of grey, there's colour. There's all sorts of permutations of action and reaction, and they all ripple out and affect everything else. So by just trying to turn to our own pain and suffering, we may see, oh, there's much more at play here than I initially thought of that person doing that thing to me. And if we start to reflect in this way, we might also see that the one that we're gathering all the blame onto isn't as fixed and separate. There's no kind of culpable entity that we can find even within ourselves. And it's this limited way of seeing the world that's giving rise to blame in the first place. And therefore it's giving rise to the suffering that we experience. So if we were enlightened, we would see this complex web of conditions just like that. We would see the complex web of conditions that give rise to all experience and allow for that there is suffering and there is joy in everyone's life. No one person or situation can be held fully and solely responsible for any action. If we were enlightened, we would see that. And this slogan is trying to help us to see things more like an enlightened person would. So by gathering all blame onto one in this way, we can reflect on how much of our own suffering is in fact not caused by what actually happened to us. It's caused by those second arrows of blame or of resentment. And what actually happened to us may at times be very painful, and there may be suffering in our lives. But our own attitude to what has happened and the stories we tell about it is probably more contributing to that pain and suffering. If we can just gather all blame onto one, stay with the pain and suffering that we are experiencing, reflect on the complex conditions that play there, we're moving more towards a wiser understanding and moving towards compassion for ourselves as well. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit now about these more extreme forms of unskillful action that some of us may have faced in the adversity in our lives. So if somebody has acted unskillfully towards you, or you have experienced great pain in response to the actions of another person, rather than entering into this cycle of blame that this slogan is suggesting we avoid, we could reflect and trust into the law of karma. So we look at karma on the introductory course as well. So each person in their own way experiences the consequences of their actions, and we don't always know how that will pan out for ourselves or for other people. We don't always know what the outcome of other people's actions will be. And in a way, we don't need to spend time thinking about that. We don't need to spend time thinking about what others deserve or don't deserve based on their own unskillful action. And it's not just that we don't need to do that, it's that by dwelling on that, we perpetuate blame and resentment, and this continues to hurt ourselves. We're not helping ourselves to heal, we're not helping ourselves to recover from any pain or suffering by dwelling on what should or shouldn't happen to the person that has acted unskillfully. And a process I've gone through with examples like this in my own life has allowed me to see that I can more clearly acknowledge my own pain and suffering by gathering blame onto myself and not looking to blame other people. I can acknowledge the actions of others and what pain and suffering has been brought about in my own life, as well as clearly see that blame can and must be transcended within that process. I can acknowledge harm by staying with the direct pain and suffering, and I don't need to ping off into this kind of what I regard as like a false refuge of blame, and the apparent but false security that offers. It can be quite attractive, it can be very attractive to kind of focus in on and perpetuate blaming other people as a way of feeling secure away from the pain and suffering that I've experienced myself. But I have seen that I can go through processes that help me to drop those stories of blame, or drop that anger and ill will, and gather all blame onto myself. And again, I think the word blame here is just very, it's quite a subtle word that has many connotations in our culture. And as I was saying earlier, we don't need to look to feel guilty or wrong or bad for anything that was beyond our control. And I think sometimes if something unskillful has happened to us, blame and shame are quite closely associated. And if something's happened to us that was beyond our control, we can sometimes feel quite a lot of shame about that. And because we feel shame and we really don't want to, we push that down, and that can lead to a lot of pain and aversion, and that can lead to a lot of blame. So we often, I think I've had to go through a very gradual process of acknowledging the ways in which I've felt pain and suffering, and beginning to acknowledge the anger or the ill will that I did feel about those things, but then also gradually bring my attention off blaming other people and just look at my own reactions in those circumstances. And I relate this to kind of like touching the earth, which our Buddha is doing here. So in the touching the earth mudra, the Buddha is calling witness to the earth goddess at his time of enlightenment, which is when Mara, the personification of doubt, comes along and says, who are you? Who are you to gain enlightenment? And he touches the earth so that the earth goddess can witness all of his practice in all of his lifetimes. And in a way, that's helped me in these instances. So I can touch the earth and I can say, this happened to me, whatever situation it is. This has happened to me. And then personally, I've gone through a process of saying, this happened to me and I thought it was my fault. This happened to me and it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault that this happened. And I've gone through experiencing quite a lot of anger and blame. This slogan, it's a mind training slogan. It's not saying that you can just go from experiencing pain and suffering, blaming other people, to just stop doing that and everything magically is okay. It is a process. So this happened to me, it was painful. This happened to me and I thought it was my fault. This happened to me and it wasn't my fault. And then that gradually turns into just, again, this just happened to me. But it's less, it feels less harsh, it feels less loaded. It's just a statement of fact of a situation of pain and suffering. And after a while of going through that process, I've then been able to say, oh, this happened to me, and oh, that was my response. How interesting. And it was gradual. I'm not saying that we can do this overnight, but gradually we can look at times of great pain and suffering where maybe some other people have been involved, maybe unskillful action has happened. We can drop the anger, we can drop the blame, and we can just come back to, this has happened, this is my response. How interesting. This was my reaction. Okay, what can I do now about that? How can I meet this pain and suffering within myself? What is the creative response to this? How can I connect with myself and how can I connect with other people in a meaningful way? And going through this process of gathering all blame onto one, being aware of my own reaction to any situation, this has kind of turned different events in my life into kind of like more of a patchwork. So in the past, there were all these kind of events in my life that were very, very painful, that I had a lot of blame and resentment for. And gradually going through this process of gathering blame onto myself, I've seen that there's a patchwork in life of adversity as well as joy. There's sorrow in my life, but there's sorrow on more sides than just my own within my life. There is hurt, but I can also feel gratitude, I can also feel appreciation within these complex relationships. It's all mixed into the patchwork of life. And I think last week, Vidania's talk on gratitude will have brought that out. We can feel grateful for everyone. Life is a mixture of pain and of sorrow. So we're working towards forgiveness with this slogan. Gathering all blame onto one, we're working towards forgiving. And I think forgiveness is a process. Forgiveness itself can sound like this thing that you just do as well as renouncing blame. But there's a process here. We can start to forgive other people. And this can take time, and it is training. This is mind training. We can uncover layers of blame as we integrate our experiences in life. And this can lead us to open up to quite a lot of pain and suffering that the blame is trying to protect us from. But the blame is completely ineffective at doing that, actually. It just drives that pain deeper. It makes that pain worse, like holding on to hot coals. So gathering all blames onto one, this is how this slogan becomes a key to compassion, if you like. So if we see the pain and suffering of our own part in the situation, we may also see the pain and suffering of others in any situation. And if we gather all blames onto one, we can start to forgive ourselves. And by forgiving ourselves, that is the route to forgiving others. Blame is never going to lead you to forgiveness. Gathering blame onto yourself, taking responsibility for your own reactions, may help you to forgive yourself, and it may then lead to help to forgive others. And these mind training slogans that we've been looking at are the ways in which we can open up to compassion. And later we'll hear other slogans that help us to see reality more through the eyes of wisdom. By this slogan, we're seeing reality through the eyes of compassion. So yeah, compassion and starting to forgive can lead to a greater sense of peace, a greater sense of contentment. It can lead to taking responsibility for our own responses and just leaving the rest, just dropping it, gathering the blame onto our own responses, And that can lead to confidence, it can lead to energy being released, it can really lead to a greater sense of empathy for the pain in the world. And it can be really quite humbling if we can see our own part in any adverse situation and take responsibility for it. It can be, quite a thing to admit to. And again, we need a strong sense of metta here as we open up to being responsible for our own reactions and the suffering that they create. But it can be quite surprising, I've found, when I've dropped stories of how others are to blame for situations in my life, how much some relationships can change within that. And we've probably all seen that as we put people in the fourth stage of the Metta Bhavana. People that you've just had a long-standing beef with at work or at college or whatever, you can start to see them more fully. You can start to build a relationship with them. So we've all seen how by taking responsibility for our own responses to people, probably you've got examples in your own life as to how that's led to more positive relationships. Having said that, we may also choose not to see some people in our lives if we acknowledge that there is adversity in our life through those relationships. We might take appropriate action to prevent further adversity in our lives. You can do that at the same time as going beyond blame. You can decide not to see somebody who you might think of as acting unskillfully and still not blame them and still gather all blames onto one. So drawing a line or setting up healthy boundaries in relationships, we can still transcend blame, and it may even allow us to transcend blame even more as we let go of anger and resentment at continued adversity. And I'll just finish with a note on what I've called third-party blame and blame culture, because I don't know if you've noticed, but as I go online at the moment, there's lots and lots about how this person said that person did this. And it can be quite compelling to get, I can kind of get quite drawn into these stories of the unskillful actions of others. And I think I have to be really careful here not to get so involved in all these situations that I've not been a part of. All different situations are different, and it's only really people that are involved in situations that know fully what's happened and can fully look to heal themselves through that. And again, it can be quite tempting to project it. If blame is something that is happening quite kind of freely for us, it can kind of spill over to blaming lots of other people for lots of other situations that we've not been a part of. And again, I think in these situations, we can use the slogan to gather blame onto ourselves, drop the stories about who did what to who over there, who we don't even know. Gather blame onto ourselves. Consider what is our own ethical practice like right now. Is there anything that we could do to that would be conducive to greater ethical, skillful mental states? Look at your own responses in your own life and transform those. That's what you have capacity to do. Bring your own actions in line with your highest ethical values and exemplify that to the world. So I'll just finish with a little kind of note on just, again, how to take these instructions, how to take these pithy instructions of the mind training, because it can all be a little bit like, just do this, don't do that, do this. And it can feel a little bit like we're being told what to do. And again, I just say with these that it's all about trying it out for yourselves. So the Buddha said, just try this, see if it leads to your own happiness and the happiness of others. So that's what we can do with this slogan. Try it out for yourself. What is it like in your own experience? Does dropping the stories of blame and gathering all blame onto one lead you to a more peaceful, still sense of what your own part in a situation has been? Does that lead you to take more responsibility for your own actions? Does that lead to a happier mental state, or does that lead to better relationships in your life? Can you move towards forgiveness by gathering all blames onto one? Just try it. And it is training. It won't happen all at once. It's not necessarily easy. This is challenging work. And it is a method. It's not saying, blame is great, everyone. Go away and blame yourselves for everything that's happened. It's a method. We do blame. Blame happens. And I was thinking of those things you used to can still get in shops. We used to sell them in the evolution shops. It says, we do this, we do that in our home. We've got one at home, and I can't remember what it says. It says like, oh, we do anger, we do I say I'm sorry, we do love, we do cuddles and stuff. So we do blame. We need to acknowledge that we do blame. And this is the method at how to go beyond blame. It's not saying go away and cultivate more blame. It's saying gather all blame onto one, and that will help you to see through it, to cut through it. And that can lead to compassion. And compassion doesn't equal having any kind of passive acceptance of any wrongdoing. Metta and compassion are the antidotes to blame. And it will allow for the suffering involved in your own life, and it will allow for the suffering of others. So yeah, gathering all blames onto one is a method for accessing positive, skillful mental states like love, like compassion, like gratitude and appreciation. You can cultivate all of these positive and skillful mental states despite and alongside all the adversity that you face in your human life. So Viktor Frankl, as some of you might know, he's an Austrian psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor. And this is a quote from him. "Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves."